Hello, everybody. Welcome to the first episode of Region Podcast. And we aim to dive deep into the complexities of the Armenian and Azerbaijani conflict. And I'm your host, I'm Hermine Virabian. And today I'm going to discuss one of the core topics of the conflict itself, the narratives, local narratives coming from Armenian and Azerbaijani side. And for that, we have our guests. Amirbekyan Aram and Sevinj Samadzade. Thanks for joining us. I'm going to give very brief introduction of you, and then I'm going to ask you to give more details about yourself. Sevinj is a feminist researcher from Azerbaijan, a member of Feminist Peace Collective. And Aram is a journalist covering mostly armed conflicts and queer issues in Caucasus. Can you elaborate on this more, Sevinj? Maybe you start.
Yeah, thank you, Hermine. Hi, everyone. Hi, Aram. So I am currently based in Belgium, but I'm from Azerbaijan, and I've been also doing a lot of research on gender, feminism, queer issues, as well as the war and conflicts. So previously I studied security studies, but now I'm more switching towards study of geopolitics and its effect on the women's life specifically. So in my PhD work is now more focused on that. But apart from this research interest, I'm mostly doing some sort of activism or practical work, let's say, in Feminist Peace Collective, which is a very small collective that is mainly based in Azerbaijan. That's all about me.
You also do research and discovering of alternative history of Karabakh.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, didn't mention it. Now that I'm shifting to more study of geopolitics, I forget my past of studying peace and conflict studies. But I mostly researched conflicts, mainly Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. So both looking at the history of the conflict, searching for alternative paths, and also the women's role in the conflict, and so on. So broadly, I can say I'm more knowledge in Nagorno-Karabakh conflict than any other conflict in the world, but I have somewhat knowledge of other conflicts as well.
Mm-hmm. Aram?
Hi everybody. My name is Aram Amirbekyan. I started doing journalism in 2020, December 2020, basically like a month after the Second Karabakh War. I, as you said, mainly focus on like issues that are connected to geopolitics and armed conflicts, particularly in South Caucasus, particularly the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. But I also write about queer people and queer issues in Armenia in particular. I'm based in Yerevan. I also right now collaborate and work with Bright Garden Voices, which is a platform dedicated to peaceful dialogue between Armenians and Azerbaijanis, which also was founded shortly after the Second Karabakh War.
Thanks a lot. It's very nice to have you, both of you here. I know that it's a very long and very complicated topic itself to discuss. And in our societies, actually, we don't have that much space to speak about the conflict itself in general, but also nuanced detail to discuss the nuanced details of it, and especially the narratives, how they're being maintained and shaped, and how they themselves shape the identity and the course of the history. Subjective reasons that we don't have space is like because people are so vulnerable, they're so affected. Many of them lost family members, lost their houses. But also the objective reason is that because of this ongoing conflict, never-ending conflict, we don't have a physical space to meet each other, to talk to each other. And most of the time when we hear about other side of the conflict, other side of the people, another country, We hear it from our state propaganda, from the news, and mostly it's connected. It's spiced up with the state propagandistic narratives, which is mostly about hating other side. And there is also this very common view and picture that when we speak about the conflict itself, the local narrative represents your side as the only victim of the war and only victim of the conflict. And it minimizes the other side's suffer, dehumanizes other side. And because of that, we have what we have. But actually, that's not the only truth, and that's not the only right side saying that we are the only victim. I would love actually to elaborate on this more, especially from Armenia, because of the Armenian genocide. Armenians love to all the time go back to that point and to start to discuss the conflict itself from there. What do you think, Aram?
I'm going to put my glasses on because my eyes started hurting. Okay, this is a really complicated issue. This is actually a multitude of complicated issues that are somehow intertwined in the understanding of many Armenians. You are entirely correct to note that a lot of the trauma that existed because of in the aftermath of the Armenian genocide, not only did it go from generation to generation, but it somehow became a part of the official Armenian narrative during the First and Second Karabakh Wars. It was this narrative of Armenians being victimized by their Turkic neighbors. It was this narrative of Armenians being which is also something I notice in the West a lot of times, something that they say is Armenia is a Christian country being victimized by its Muslim neighbors. There are many, many reasons behind this. But I think the main issue here is that because of the historical and also some sort, in a way, ethnic connections between Azerbaijanis and Turks, Armenians somehow started to see them as the same, as the same nation, as the same peoples. So the potential threat that they perceived from Azerbaijanis, they somehow connected it to the threat that existed in the Ottoman Empire. Even though we can go back in history and see that, for example, the mutual pogroms between Armenians and Azerbaijanis that happened in the early 1900s, they happened much more in the Russian Empire than in the Ottoman Empire. And those are two different geopolitical entities. But Armenians started seeing them as the same. And I think this was also a narrative pushed by the Armenian intellectuals a lot of the times, the Armenian nationalist elites a lot of the time, particularly when the Karabakh movement was starting in 88. And during the First War and in the aftermath of the First War, and late 90s, early 2000s, already my time, where after I was born, this was something that I continuously heard. And I also think that when it comes to the idea of the victim or the sole victim in a particular conflict, I think, I am no expert on many other conflicts that exist in the world, but I can say that what seems interesting to me in the Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict is that I never, or at least for a really long time already, I haven't really seen any clear aggressor-victim dynamic that you can put a finger on, because the dynamic always shifts depending on who who has the quote-unquote military victory. In the 90s, it was Armenia. In 2020, it was Azerbaijan. And I know that Sevinj can talk more about this, but I know that like Azerbaijan as a country was founded, amongst other things, on that very defeat, while Armenia was founded on that victory. And I feel like historically there has never been like a single victim. The victims have been the people who have suffered continuously during those two wars, particularly the people of the working class, the people who didn't make money off of this war, the people who were sent to defend the land that belonged to many, many oligarchs who funded and fueled this enmity, this rivalry, and these wars.
Sevinj, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I have a few thoughts, and I want to thank Aram for this very comprehensive overview already. I agree specifically with the last sentence, how this conflict has been the conflict of that is deeply rooted historically in the imperial clash, in the process of nation-state building, which is usually very brutal and violent. And the aftermath of this nation-state building process and the clash of empires, to put it in a very brief way. But who has been the victim of these wars and conflicts? As Aram said, it has been mostly the common people on both sides, but the way the victimhood has been perceived has been different, of course. I mean, it's very prevalent for all the conflicts where one side sees itself as a victim and the other side as an aggressor. But the victim and aggressor dichotomy is never blunt, is never like really sharp in any of the conflicts that we see, specifically the conflicts between post-imperial, post-colonial nation states. So, and Nagorno-Karabakh conflict is not exception in that sense. But the view of victimhood is deeply rooted in these historical grievances and losses. Of course, each side focuses on their own suffering, and the suffering is generational. Sometimes the suffering is sometimes mythical. Sometimes the suffering is collective. Sometimes it's individual, but it keeps supporting the dominant narratives and dominant thoughts in the society, and in that sense gives legitimacy to the states to use this opportunity, to use these narratives as an opportunity for their own regime survival, for their own power, and public backing only works for them. So public backing for Azerbaijan using this victimhood was very prevalent after the 90s war, when Azerbaijan officially lost the war. So the whole Azerbaijani political elite and the regime kept this victimhood as a main tool, as a main source of continuity of their power. And public opinion was very much in sort of very interesting power dynamics between the political elites and the public, was also kind of transmitting through civil society and opposition as well. So victimhood was also used by opposition against the political elites, which made the regime to keep the Nagorno-Karabakh issue as a main issue to hold on to. And while they were holding on to this victimhood, they also parallelly, of course, creating this narrative of power, the narrative of revenge, the narrative of at one point having Karabakh back. So this narrative was all the time there. So I think the sense of victimhood, on one way, of course, drains the society, because constantly thinking that you are a victim is giving you the emotional drain as a collective, mostly as a people. But on the other hand, it gives certain negative emotions which can drive for something. Unfortunately, the drive wouldn't have been war itself, but usually it is a war. It could have been something else. It could have been some sort of creative outcome of this victimhood, but we never see that. Usually, this victimhood ends in another form of violence. That's why I don't see the side seeing themselves as a victim at any point being helpful. I think the victimhood in the end leads to from one form of violence to another form of violence, which is usually unaddressed. And while they are unaddressed, it keeps shaping itself in different forms, basically. And again, political elites use it for their own gains. It happened in Azerbaijan. Now what's happening after 2020 war, this victimhood and this sort of dishonor of losing the war in the 90s has been shifted to the victory. But to some extent, I wouldn't say that victimhood is completely gone now, since Azerbaijan won. There is still this victimhood continuing to some extent. Still, the continuity of victimhood is something that is sort of inherent now in the creation of Azerbaijani nation, which means that Azerbaijani nation still is incomplete in its formulation, in its transformation. So that's why it still requires this victimhood to carry on with maybe new forms of aggression or something like that.
It's so interesting that you also mentioned, depending on the timing when we're looking to the course of the history, because it's like it's always difficult to understand from where we should start to look to the history, because there's like so many things that were happening. And 90s, the history was different throughout like those 30, and then things started to change 20, and after 23, and all the time the discussion also regarding the topic and justice itself is changing depending from when we start to look to the conflict itself. And also it's a dilemma that we are facing all the time. People love to go back to the history, like to the rules, like and discussing it from sometimes people also do it as we mentioned also from since genocide. But here comes also this problem itself. How far should we go back when we start to talk about this conflict itself?
Is it a question to me or to Aram? Or
both, actually, yes.
Well, I can briefly comment. Going back to history is helpful because history is very important. Yeah, to look at the history is one of the ways to understand what happened in the past. But what is the purpose of looking at history? Yeah? So we are talking about here a critical or alternative way of looking at history, not this traditional way of history making that is usually made through some sort of power relations and some sort of goal or mission of creating knowledge about past. So when you create knowledge about past, it has a purpose, and the purpose should be, for instance, in this case, should be for peace. But usually the history is that have been narrated, or the knowledge of past that has been created usually was targeting to make it more nationalistic, to make it more as a source of more aggression and more hatred. So when history does not hold this objective truth, but rather this sort of subjective ideas, which history doesn't hold for me any objective truth anyways, but when it's so much manipulated, when it has changed so much with their own version of the history, that it becomes a source of problem itself. So the history that we are now looking at is maybe the main problem itself, because it is the problem that in the Azerbaijani education system, for instance, how history has been taught is one of the reasons why the knowledge about past is so much falsified and so much blurry for a lot of Azerbaijanis. But should we completely avoid it? No, we have to look at the history critically and perhaps look specifically at the times when the first clash, as Aram mentioned already before, between Azerbaijanis and Armenians happened in the Tsarist Empire. So that's one of the main sources of the conflict, the first emergence of violence between these two communities that happened, because before that we have historical evidence that these two communities lived together and without any clash of violence. So specifically, that is a time when we see the clashes emerging. We also see the identities becoming more towards the national identity rather than the religious identity. And we see these national intellectuals putting their force in the creation of nation state. And while they create this nation state, they choose certain empires that gives them power, resources, or tools to sort of create their states, or the other way around. The empires don't want them to create or to isolate their state or separate their nation state. So we have to look at the history. I think mainly for the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, the main source of history we have to look, which actually, in fact, is not very well researched. I must really highlight that. Now I know some scholars are focusing on that at the moment, but we don't have really very good comprehensive research on the start of this epilogue of this violence that happened between Azerbaijanis and Armenians at the end of 19th century and early 20th century. Yeah.
But at the same time, as you mentioned, the history itself is so subjective, and it's more not about the facts, but it's more about representation of it. And I can remember from Armenian side itself, it's like well-handed subjective facts or representation. For example, especially when we speak about 7 regions that Armenia occupied in 90s, this is not a well-known fact, It's still the history, but how to find also these alternative resources of learning the history, we don't know. There are not that many resources available for the people. I think for many years, majority of Armenian society also didn't have the knowledge that those regions are really occupied by Armenian side. There was no public opinion on that there were also IDPs from Azerbaijan who lost so many houses, and those people, also have a right to return to their homes. And if you would start this kind of conversation, they would find any justification about this, like safety zone or whatever, but you will not have a space to approach to conflict from different sides. Did you also have this experience, Aram?
Yes. Well, the discussion of like Armenian history and Azerbaijani history, and also the mutual history that we share, has like been a really, again, like a complex and really difficult topic, because I'm sure I actually very much agree with Sevinj that like the historiographical research in Azerbaijan as well as in Armenia has been entirely blurred. And like I can tell you from my experience as a school kid, a lot of our history textbooks were basically like propaganda. It's always state propaganda. The way we read history, we consume history, is somehow suited for the needs of whoever holds the power in that particular nation state. So I think there are several aspects of this to consider. The first one, if we go not so far back, the 7 regions. The 7 regions, as you mentioned, a lot of Armenians didn't know what they were. A lot of Armenians didn't know because it wasn't coherently explained to them that the 7 regions did not have an Armenian population, and that there were Azerbaijanis who were ethnically cleansed from those regions. Hundreds of thousands of people lost their lives and livelihoods during those ethnic cleansings. A lot of Armenians didn't know that. A lot of Armenians didn't understand the state of the then status quo, the state of the conflict pre-2020. But also another aspect to consider when it comes to the 7 regions, which I noticed even like among some leftists in Armenia, and not only in Armenia, is, and this goes back to the idea of how far back we can go to the history, is the concept of Armenian indigeneity to Nagorno-Karabakh, as well as like surrounding regions, Turkey, some parts of Azerbaijan or Iran, etc. So in this case, leftists or any other people who were supporting Armenia's position, the official position of the Armenian state, were arguing that the atrocities committed by the Armenian army could be justified on the basis of Armenian indigeneity on those lands. So this is, I think, an attempt to try and bring the Western political concepts which exist in like the ideas of Western colonialism onto a region where it absolutely doesn't suit and doesn't make sense. I agree that we need to do proper historical research to understand the relations between Armenians and Azerbaijanis, to understand the sometimes horrific events that occurred in the aftermath of basically the crumbling of many, many empires, which created another world order. But I think the most important thing to do is to make sure that the history that we're teaching to our people, to our children, is not a biased account, is not just a bunch of fables that are suited for the needs of a certain demographic, but are actually well-researched accounts of what actually happened as much as we can, basically.
Yeah, I'm not even sure that we have a ground nowadays, especially after so many things that happened, to be able also to do that, And now we have those conversations and talks about possible peace and agreement, but it's so complicated to understand how we reach to the peace when for 30 years we had so many options to do that, and especially Armenia had a huge position of also investing in that peace building the way, so we don't also reach to the point that we are now. But at the same time, we didn't. And there is so much responsibility now also on people, that people should do their work. And the government itself is just like washing away their hands and going, that's what they did for a long time. And now they're making decisions that it's also not understandable and doesn't create a sense of safety for people. And also the sense, like when we speak about peace, what is peace itself firstly for the states and also for the people themselves?
Okay, maybe I will start. Peace and security are two main concepts that I think people and states use while thinking about any form of conflict. Sometimes they use it interchangeably, as if peace is security and security is peace. But then the question rises, whose security? Yeah. And in that sense, it becomes very clear that state security is, in fact, creating the insecurity of the people. So it's very much contradicting, specifically in the societies where militarism is so strong. For the purpose of security again, but this militarization in the end means that people's insecurities are constantly there, and they will be under threat. And because of being under threat, the insecurities will rise at some point, and there's always this possibility of war and threat coming up. So while we talk about security, in fact, it means insecurity. And that's why when they talk about peace now, almost similarly, what they mean is those insecurities. I mean, when I say they, I mean the political elites and the states narrative. So on a state level, peace is always understood as a victory. Peace is always understood not as a compromise, not as something proactive or non-violent. Peace is quite violent in the eyes of states. And it has been historically like that all the time. Peace meant pacification. When the colonizer came and colonized certain territories to bring peace for them, which meant from one form of violence, you switch to another form of violence, calling it peace now. And that's why the resistance or self-defense as a form of aggression counts down to who does it. So who has this right to self-defend itself? Who has its right to fight for peace, basically? I would say, in the words of Lenin, who said that if you want peace, you have to prepare for war. So peace is not something that is nonviolent, and the peace of the political elites or the ruling elites usually comes hand in hand with the violence for the people. But about like this very apart from this very philosophical conversation about peace and conflict, I think practically what it means now, peace for Azerbaijani society, has changed. So of course, I mean, I did a lot of research on people's opinion about Nagorno-Karabakh conflict for years and years, like starting from 2013, I was involved in a lot of peacebuilding projects. I could see how the envisioning of peace can shift when you learn. So dreaming about peace or doing something for peace or practicing peace or envisioning it really comes with a knowledge, with learning and also with unlearning certain things. And that's what peacebuilding was. It was creating a space for people to learn and unlearn things. And this was the process of actual peace building. But while this was happening, we could also see how certain issues are not being addressed and how the states are inherently violent in their approach to the solution of the conflict. So peace was never on the agenda, while there were certain attempts at some point to have these peace processes between Azerbaijan and Armenia. In reality, peace was always demonized. People who were practicing peace, doing some sort of peace building project, were particularly targeted in Azerbaijan. So always these projects were hidden from a society. So it never actually had some sort of impact for changing the public opinion. Yet it did its work on some levels, let's say, mostly on the civil society level, and sometimes in the grassroots level, not so successfully. So there were these attempts, both in Azerbaijan and Armenia, to create some sort of ground for people to reconcile, people to communicate, and a lot of attempts actually were done until the 2020 war, when everything completely collapsed. But then after the 2020, something new started emerging, and that's where we see that we started radically looking at peace. At least some networks, some groups, some people started questioning the peace that we envisioned before 2020 and after 2020, because people who were involved in the peace building were supporting war, were quite nationalist. So what is peace? And now Azerbaijani government is using the same narrative for the peace process. It creates this whole image that it is for peace. It's going to sign this peace agreement, but what does it mean for the people of Armenia and Azerbaijan is a big question. Does this peace agreement really going to address the insecurities of the people? Will it stop the militarism that is so much prevalent? Or how this sort of border delimitation process that they started and they violently proceeded, what it will mean for the border communities now? Will they see threat, or will they stop feeling this threatened anymore? What it means for the Nagorno-Karabakh Armenians who are ethnically cleansed from Karabakh now, and will it mean that they will be able to go back to their home and be in peace? So I think a lot of questions are still there unanswered, and because of this avoidance of the political elites to answer these questions, I personally really don't see how this will lead to peace anytime soon. Although there is a potential, of course, in theory, it's really possible to achieve or to have some sort of peace that will be secure for the people as well. But in the current reality, I see peace more as another version of violence now.
But at the same time, there is the factor of power that we have, power dynamics that we have in our countries, and how to also the people will ask all the time this question: how to come to the peace when the other side is like Azerbaijan backed by Turkish power, and how can we also trust them? Yeah, it's a complicated topic to discuss, but I think Aram, you have a point about this also having an agreement also with a dictator.
Well, this has many aspects as well. If we talk about like peace and what that word has historically meant, I can tell you that in my lifetime, I have heard it in like probably all the possible interpretations when I was in Armenia, when like there was a conversation about potential peace, or not even a peace agreement, but like just a vague idea of peace with Azerbaijanis. If we're talking about what the state was doing, the Armenian state was pre-2020, so when Armenia was still in the quote-unquote winning position, Armenia was continuously pushing this narrative of Armenia wants peace, but Azerbaijan is attacking. And this was the time where Armenia was de facto controlling not only practically the entire Nagorno-Karabakh, but also 7 regions surrounding Nagorno-Karabakh, from which Azerbaijan is, and not only from which had been ethnically cleansed. So Armenia was talking about peace. Armenians were talking about peace, and so was the Armenian state. But what that peace meant was basically Azerbaijan leaving everything alone, and the status quo just continuing. So basically, before 2020, Armenia was talking about like the continuation and extension, forever extension of the then status quo. After 2020, and this is also a new government, this is like a government which came to power through popular protests, which also actually pushed and did the war. This government is now talking about a different level of peace. This government is talking about Armenians knowing the limits of their borders. This government is talking about normalizing relations with Azerbaijanis and Turks, which is with Azerbaijan and Turkey rather than Azerbaijanis and Turks, which basically is something that I haven't really heard from other Armenian governments and also other Azerbaijani governments, because the situation was different back then. But if you look at what they actually mean when they're saying normalization now, or when they're saying peace, or when they're saying peace agreement, I think a friend of mine, when we were having a conversation about this, Aram Amirbekyan, put it in an interesting way. She said, like, they're talking about a new business package. This is a new business package. They're talking about the restarting the railway connections. They're talking about restarting trade. They're talking about basically like reviving the South Caucasus capital, which may actually solve some of the problems of the common people in Armenia and Azerbaijan, but not all of those problems. Sevinj is correct to notice that neither Aliyev nor Pashinyan are actually good at addressing, or are even trying to addressing the insecurities that people have who live in the border regions, the insecurities that people have who are whose sons or like family members are going to the army. We can also talk about the militarization that has existed in Armenia, and I'm sure in Azerbaijan, for decades. We can talk about the non-combat deaths that have occurred in Armenia year on and year on. which is also a result of that militarization and which are not investigated properly. So in that sense, yeah, they're talking like they're opening the borders for the business, but are they opening the borders for the people? Are they trying to work on the rivalry or on the fears and insecurities that the people have? I'm not sure. So when Armenia signed the declaration of November 9th and all those territories were given back to Azerbaijan rather, people were shocked. This was like a mass shock that was existing in Yerevan. And I think like in that sense, it kind of started to snowball into this panic that like if Azerbaijan took back those territories, then Azerbaijan can attack and will attack more. And then a lot of right-wing and nationalist media outlets in Azerbaijan, as Sevinj mentioned, started talking about the concept of Western Azerbaijan. This was a concept that existed before, but then it got popularized. With Azerbaijan winning the 2020 war, and also like with basically also I think Azerbaijan in a way realizing, or like the Azerbaijani elites realizing that Armenia cannot necessarily defend its own borders right now. So like that was something that people are genuinely scared of. People are not scared of like the return of the Soviet times where we all kind of lived together. People are scared of losing their livelihoods. Because if you listen to what people, particularly in the border regions, are speaking, it's not the fascist rhetoric you may hear from the streets and the protests in Yerevan. It's actually a rhetoric of actually like reminiscing the past that has existed with the fear that that past is gone and will not come back, which is why it's scary to live next door. And these are the grievances, these are the insecurities that need to be addressed. But I think what's happening right now, particularly between the states of Armenia and Azerbaijan, is a tit for tat. It's a geopolitical tit for tat for like to try and like pull the rope everyone in their own direction, and it completely overlooks the security grievances, the fears and the issues that exist in Armenia's border regions, that exist in Armenia's towns, that exist in Armenia's cities and in the capital city as well. So in that sense, I think like we need to talk about how to deal with this situation, how to deal with those grievances. And I don't necessarily have any hope in the Armenian government or the Azerbaijani government, but I do think the peace building sphere, the people who were in peace building and are in peace building particularly, need to focus more on those grievances and on dialogue and on mutual understanding than they have done in the past. And this, like one example I always bring up because I think it's a really good example, was Georgi Vanyan and the Takali process that he was doing, which was later sabotaged and like which later stopped, but it was a process that actually allowed people from like Armenia and Azerbaijan and border regions as well to at the very least talk to each other. And this was a process that was happening before 2020. And I think now is the time to restart processes like this. Now is the time to basically like start talking to each other without the mediation of the state. Because the state is not on your side. The state is on the side of business. The state is on the side of money.
I'm very glad that you mentioned this economic project think, we can't underestimate that factor, how this was an economic also play for decades for Russia, how it is now for Turkey, how Karabakh itself is turning as a place of money laundering for those countries. And it's a topic also that we will discuss in our upcoming episodes. And for today, I think we sum up. Thanks a lot for coming and bringing your ideas. I was very glad to have you here, and see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Hermine.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Aram. Bye.
Bye.